So, let me see how. Thinking of minimizing my screen, but I think. Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for joining the class. So apologies for going online because this will cancel the class. We've had public holidays on the last two classes that's effectively cancelled our classes, and it's not appropriate that we should, go ahead and again not have classes. Okay. Can we have somebody that will be responding from time to time, whether it's a class rep or somebody, so that we don't, when I ask questions, but I know that you guys are listening or you're available. I don't want to talk to myself. I'm struggling to in this class.
All right,
Any
so
volunteer? Okay. So in this class, I think we're supposed to start on the issue of the West African Gas Pipeline Treaty and the West African Gas Pipeline Act. I will assume that everybody has read those two provisions because you have been told to familiarize yourself with issues in advance. Have you not? You can't tell me you haven't. So, and if you haven't, well, it's up to you to look it up. It's an important topic. Take it the way you want. The West African Gas Pipeline Project is a treaty. The name is Treaty on the West African Gas Pipeline Project between the Republic of Benin and the Republic of Ghana and the Republic of Nigeria and the Republic of Togo. That's the issue. I would leave you guys to go and review the entire provision. But when I mention things like key provisions, I want you to pay special attention to key provisions, because if I ask you about what are the key provisions, what are the important provisions that you know, these are the things that I would expect you to put in place. I mean, you all have your phones, if you have or your laptops, and look it up, the treaty. You can see now that the first thing, what is the first thing you see whenever you see a treaty? What's the first provision that you normally find when you see a treaty? Can anyone help? Anybody? Okay, nobody.
Hello, sir. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. What's the first thing that comes into play? Can't hear you. Can you hear me? That's why I don't like this. These classes are incredibly bad because you'll be asking 20 times, can you hear me? Can anyone hear me, please?
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Sorry? If you don't know the question, the answer, then that's fine. Just say we don't know or something. So that we can move on. We don't spend all our time. You hear them and you don't hear them. Okay? So it usually have a preamble, won't it? Treaties usually have a preamble where they just talk generally as to why the parties came together and what they want to do. And and that's the same like this present provision as well. And some of the things it talks about, if you look at the second provision, the first provision is the states parties to the present treaty. That tells you that it's the countries that are party to the treaties, not anybody else. And then it talks about in the second provision, their second line, they are considering heads of agreement. It talks about heads of agreement that they signed, MOU signed on the West African gas pipeline by state parties on one hand, and then Chevron Nigeria Limited, Ghana National Petroleum Corporation, replaced by Water River Authority, NNPC, Shell Petroleum of Nigeria, Societe Benoit the gas, which is from Republic of Benin, and Societe Togolaise the gas, SA from Togo. So you see, all these state actors, are there, and also their representatives in the commercial sphere are there. That's the state-owned gas company. Okay, and what the second line they're talking about, confident. Basically, they say that they are confident that the West African gas pipeline will provide a new market for natural gas and basically expand sources of energy in the West African region. And this will improve the balance of energy requirements and resources and foster closer relations and ties between the states. These are some of the things that they want, the desired objectives of the West African gas pipeline. They go further and desire us to talk about how those member states of ECOWAS should cooperate and the development of energy programs in accordance with the ECOWAS Treaty, and also desirous also to permit the construction, the ownership, and operation of the West African gas pipeline by the private sector. See, very, very clear there. That is the private sector that will drive this operation. It was never envisaged that the governments themselves would operate the West African gas pipeline. Okay. Next point there is talks about recognizing that the West African gas pipeline should be governed by a harmonized legal and fiscal regime, regulated by a joint authority and made subject to the jurisdiction of the common judicial body. Do you remember what I talked about the different types of pipelines, of approaches to pipelines? You can have a regime where the state governments are the ones that would operate the pipelines that are on their own land, or you can have a harmonized system whereby there's a new authority that will govern the pipeline. And this is what in place for the West African gas. And then the final preamble thing there is recognizing therefore that the effective and harmonized implementation of the West African gas pipeline will require that each state party adopts uniform legislation governing the West African gas pipeline. So every state in this treaty must adopt a uniform legislation. Okay? And not only this allows us to have a West African gas pipeline authority, which is basically like an executive and a regulator, and a West African gas pipeline tribunal, like a common judicial body. Are we together? Are we together?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So do hereby agrees as follows. Article 1, interpretation. So straightforward. I've been through the preamble, and I want you to make sure you understand and try to extract some of the key provisions in the West African gas pipeline. You'll find that what we need to do, look at the West African Gas Pipeline Treaty, and then we also look at the West African Gas Pipeline Act. This is the Nigerian legislation, and to know the key points on both the instruments, then we should be able to even compare and contrast those key provisions. Okay? Now, so if you look at key provisions of the West African Gas Pipeline Treaty, is that the objectives and scope of the treaty are clear. It establishes a legal and institutional framework for the development, construction, and operation. The development, construction, and operation of the West African Gas Pipeline. And the objectives of the treaty, as I've said earlier on, all of that in the preamble, facilitates cross-border natural gas transportation from Nigeria to the Republic of Benin, to Togo, and then finally to Ghana. So who are the participating states that signed this? It was signed by those countries I've mentioned severally. And it was done under the auspices of ECOWAS. Very important to note that ECOWAS played a role there. So what is the governance framework for this West African gas pipeline? What is the governance framework? Governance is always important when you look at things. What is the governance framework? Article 2 talks about general principles, construction and operation of West African Gas Pipeline Treaty. Article 3 talks about legislative and regulatory framework and regulatory measures. So, Article 4, what are the, I mentioned this before, but what are we looking at when we are looking at the governance framework? Okay. In this kind of situation, can we have people have discipline in class and mute their phones, please?
Maybe I see I don't even do the put. Like I know they see some corruption.
Can anyone hear me? Hello.
Yes, sir, we can hear you, sir.
Yes, sir. I can hear you, sir.
The person that's supposed to be in class that is moving around and causing problems for me. Is he part of this class or a stranger to us? Does he have a name or she?
Network bad. Yeah. And it's everywhere.
Okay, look at the. I guess you guys are not be serious about your classes, so I'll treat you in the same way. Okay. We go on to the talk about governance framework and issues about. There will be usually in these frameworks you find a committee of ministers that would be taking oversight at the ministerial level, and then you also have the West African Gas Pipeline Authority that would regulate and oversee the entire project. And that I think was mentioned earlier on in class. I also mentioned the fact that in Article 4 that talks about West African Gas Pipeline Authority, Article 4 1.1 talks about the state parties hereby establish the West African Gas Pipeline Authority, which shall compulsory be an international institution having legal personality and financial autonomy. That just tells you the status of the West African Gas Pipeline Authority. National institution having legal personality and financial autonomy. The West African Gas Pipeline Authority shall, in each of the state parties, be recognized as a legal person capable under the laws of that state party of assuming rights and obligations and being a party to legal proceedings and so forth. Okay, that tells you about the establishment. And then it now goes on to talk about jurisdiction, powers, and functions, and it's all itemized underneath that under that provision. Okay, talks about their regulatory functions, talks about their decisions and actions. So it's pretty much comprehensive, and it says that there will be Director General under 4 subsection 1. There shall be Director General of the West African Gas Pipeline Authority, who shall be the Chief Executive Officer of the authority. Shall make all decisions and take all actions as provided by it. Now, if you look at 4.3, the Committee of Ministers may remove the DG for good cause upon the recommendation of the Board of Governors. So, when I'm talking about the governance framework, you should bear in mind the different institutions that are playing here. Talk about Committee of Ministers, talk about the DG as the CEO, talk about the West African Gas Pipeline Authority, talk about what else did I talk about? Board of Governors and so forth. Okay. Under Article 5.1, class rep, class rep
Hello, sir.
Forward to me the name of the transgressor on my class, because that person will not be given a credit for being in this class. Forward to me the name of the transgressor, or be in trouble yourself. Okay? Right. Board of Governors. The West African Gas Pipeline Authority shall have a board of governors composed of 4 members. So the head of state of each shall appoint 1 member. Okay? And those members will serve for 4 years, except for the first members appointed by 2 of the state parties. 1 from a French-speaking state party and 1 from English-speaking state party. So you can see even from West African Gas Pipeline, Nigeria and Ghana are clearly the English-speaking parties, while Togo and the Republic of Benin are the French-speaking. And as a result of that, the official languages will be English and French. Okay. Are we together? Anybody lost? Anybody know I've read ahead? Okay, moving on. Talk about governance framework. Then there's the issue of the company, actually, the West African Gas Pipeline Company, which will have rights and obligations to manage, to move gas within its network. What we also find is that there is a regulatory framework. Look up the regulatory framework. And including that regulatory framework is that they have a uniform regulatory regime, because there's a West African Gas Pipeline regulations of uniform, which is applicable to all jurisdictions. So we don't have a situation where it happened in Ghana, it happened in Nigeria, and the rules are different. No, there's a uniform law that governs anything that happens in that pipeline. What about rights of way and property? Because you remember, anything involving pipelines, they're going to move, you may have to remove people's property or set back that infrastructure. So issues of rights of way and property are always very important. So member states are the ones that have the obligation to provide access to land and sea corridors for this pipeline construction and operation. You must provide access. So it's for you, the state government, to deal with any issues to do with your internal issues of right of way. Then issues on tax, issues on taxation or the fiscal regime. You see that the treaty provides for a fiscal regime, of course, like they all do. And fiscal regimes are always very, very important. They're always very important when you deal with pipelines, because it's there to generate revenue. And every state which this thing crosses will want to get something out of it. Okay? So Article 5 there, this talks about agreed fiscal regime. Okay? So the first provision there, 5.1, says that the state parties hereby agree to and shall ensure that their respective tax authorities shall fully apply the agreed fiscal regime to the company and all applicable persons. So there's a fiscal regime that would be applicable to all, not depending on the country where you live. Then Article 2, subsection 2 of the Article 5 talks about apportionment of fiscal revenue among the state parties. Okay, so state parties would have some level of apportionment of revenue, and there's a whole formula worked out in it. I'm not expecting you to know the formula. Okay, so take it easy. All right. Now, because you have a fiscal regime, a dependent fiscal regime, Article 6 talks about a fiscal review board. So the fiscal review board is an ad hoc body that will be constituted only when required to hear an application for review. So if there's a problem with the tax, that fiscal review board would be constituted, and shall have, under subsection 3 there of Article 6, shall have exclusive jurisdiction to hear applications filed by any applicable persons for review of a decision or action or inaction. Okay, either is taken by a state party, taken by tax authority, or any state authority or West African Gas Pipeline Authority. Anything involving that administrative fiscal regime would be covered. Okay, and who are the members of this fiscal review board? We're talking about the head of the tax authority in each state party or their authorized representative. Okay. I talked about West African Gas Pipeline Tribunal. Find the provisions there also under the Act. Yeah. Under look at Article 7 that talks about project documentation. Okay. Because an international project agreement was basically executed by the state parties on their behalf by the Committee of Ministers. Okay. And under this Article 7, sub 2(1) talks about an agreed regime and stability. They want this project to be stable, and that's why they said that the pipeline will be governed by the following set of instruments, rules, and principles. So these are the things that will govern the pipelines, and this will create a measure of stability because you know the ground norm and the rules that govern it. It talks about the treaty, international project agreement, enabling legislation that was enacted in the domestic law of each state, the rules of procedure, and all other instruments forming part of or implementing the agreed regime. All principles of international law, international treaties, and domestic legislation as is applicable to the treaty. Okay. So what if you act? What if you're in breach? What's the action? Under subsection 3 there, action in event of breach of the treaty. What would then happen? You'll be acting in breach. Okay. State parties affected by breach or action of another state party shall compulsory serve a notice concerning the breach of the offending state parties with a request to cease and cure the breach. And it talks about there that the state party in breach shall cease any such actions and cure any such breach, promptly on receiving the notice. Okay. And then there's a possibility of taking action and enforcing remedies under this treaty, under the ECOWAS revised treaty, and other general rules of international law. So you have remedies. The remedies will be under West African Gas Pipeline Treaty, under the ECOWAS revised treaty, and under the general principles of international. So the fact that you're a member of this body does not mean that you forgo your rights under international law. Keep talking about key provisions. Is everything key? Because so many things are important, but you don't want everything to be important, and then we're not able to. Okay, let me move on there and just briefly mention who owns the pipeline, ownership of the West African Gas Pipeline Principle. It is built and operated by the company as a build, operate, own project. The BOO project, BOO, build, operate, own project. It's not build, operate, and transfer back to anybody. It's build, operate, own project. And that company has exclusive ownership and operating rights over the West African Gas Pipeline, all assets. Okay. That means that every state party now has to promise that they will not expropriate the pipeline. Okay. What are issues to do with dispute resolution? Dispute resolution is always important. Dispute resolution, Article 11 Article 11, dispute resolution. How do you settle disputes between state parties? Where a dispute arises between two or more state parties from the interpretation or application of this treaty, the state parties concerned shall endeavor to settle such a dispute through consultations in accordance with Section 3 of Article 10. So they want to encourage you to first consult and try and resolve matters, not make it in a kind of legalistic kind of way. They try and settle your dispute. And it talks about subsection 2 talks about reference to ECOWAS Court of Justice. If the state parties are unable to reach an agreement within a period of 6 months from the date of dispute, then any of the parties may refer the dispute to the ECOWAS Court of Justice. And the ECOWAS Court of Justice shall finally resolve the dispute in accordance with the rules of procedure of the ECOWAS Court of Justice. This means that there is no other court you can take the matter to. So anything involving dispute resolution, the matter for the ECOWAS. Very good. Are we good? Nobody? Hello?
They are good, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So I think
good, sir.
So I was able to thank you. I was able to give you the key provisions in the treaty. As I said, I'm sure you've read it, so you don't have any problem. If we look at the West African Gas Pipeline Act as enacted by Nigeria, I believe I've discussed this in class. It's the West African Gas Pipeline Project Act 2005. The West African Gas Pipeline Project Act 2005. Okay. Why do we need this? You can see with the treaty was saying that all state parties must go and enact their own legislation to put, this international treaty under the framework of national law. Okay. Does the West African Gas Pipeline does it have a provision, detailed provisions dealing with tax? Some of the things that you should know is the environmental, the taxation aspects of the treaty is important, and as well as the environmental protection aspects, because these are key attributes. Whether it talks about the need for an EIA, environmental impact assessment, environmental management plan, and so forth. There are provisions that you must bear in mind. So that requires you to have a careful reading of the okay. Are we good? We're talking now about we discussed, I think, many times how the Nigerian Constitution requires you to it's not a money system, it's a dual system whereby the country must locally implement or domesticate national treaties before it becomes law. So it is the West African Gas Pipeline Project Act 2005. That act, if you look at the section, part 1 talks about corporate matters, basically the local incorporation of West African Gas Pipeline Company, the shippers, buyers, and other people, so forth. Part 2, this will be the West African Gas Pipeline Authority. We told you that that authority, of course, was created under the treaty, but this now gives it legal status in relation to Nigeria. Part 2 talks about West African Gas Pipeline Authority. Part 3 deals with the important issue of licensing. Licensing. When you deal with the pipeline, let's not talk about the complications of a pipeline that is transboundary, that covers different jurisdictions, different legal frameworks, different legal cultures, and different approaches to judicial authority. Forget, put that on one side. What about the issue of license? Even within a country, it can be difficult. I want to draw a pipeline from Lagos to Kano. I'm going to cross, I don't know, 6 states or 7 states, 6 states, and each of those states will need issues to do with to know the terrain. How are you going to go? Which is the best route to go? How should the pipeline go? What will be the duration of the license? What are the rights conferred on the license by the license? Because the license must give a right. So licensing has rights conferred. Approval to operate. The state authority must give an approval to operate. You can't just go and set up your own pipeline entity. You must take license from the government. And in this case of Part 3 of licensing, Section 17 talks about transmission, export, or import of natural gas. It knows that natural gas will come and it will go. 18 dealing natural gas by the pipelines and buyers and so forth. All of these things are very important. And if you look at Section 19, it talks about restriction on transmission of natural gas during the emergency period. If there's an emergency in Nigeria, for instance, would we want the gas the pipeline to be taking all our gas away? It's not realistic. We will have to suspend it. Part 4 talks about the West African gas pipeline regulations. So there are regulations, detailed regulations to govern the West African gas pipeline project. And who is going to do this? There's a minister. There's a minister giving this authority to create regulations. Because why do we need powers to create regulations? Can anyone answer me? Why do we have powers? I'm listening. Why do we have powers to govern legislation? Regulations. Why do we need powers for regulation? Nobody? Okay. Usually regulations are created as part of legislation. The legislation has the broader framework. The specifics will now be left to regulations that as put together by the minister. And that's why the West African Gas Pipeline Regulations talks about the minister shall adopt and implement as delegated legislation the West African Gas Pipeline Regulation. The minister is given the responsibility for dealing with WACP. WACP is the West African Gas Pipeline Regulation. Okay? And any such regulation, amendments, or supplements have to be consistent with the regulations adopted in Benin, Ghana, and Togo, and must be consistent with the treaty and this act. Okay? Note under Section 20, sub 3, the West African Gas Pipeline Authority shall have exclusive power to administer and enforce the West African Gas Pipeline Regulations in Nigeria, and may collaborate with the minister or any relevant agency of government. Are we good?
Yes, I have a question, sir.
Go ahead. I'm listening. Go ahead. Hello. I can't hear anything. No. I also have questions. I can't hear anything on your behalf. Lady, I want to ask questions. I also have questions.
I think he got disconnected from the class.
Sorry?
The person that has the question, I think she got disconnected.
Yeah, go ahead now. Go ahead for how many minutes?
Oh, I'm so
Go
sorry,
ahead.
somebody logged me out, sir. So I was
Okay.
asking that the reason for the distinction between the West African Pipeline Treaty and the West African Gas Pipeline Project, 2005.
What's the what?
Like, is there any reason for the distinction? Like, is there any distinction or differences between the West African Pipeline Treaty and
That's the kind of question I want you to bear in mind. That's one of the questions I want to bear in mind. The point is that we have a treaty on one hand, and we have domestic law on the other hand. Yeah, they are probably a clone of each other, but are they exactly the same? That's the question I want you to bear in mind. The important question that I want you guys to bear in mind. Okay.
all right, sir?
Now, which of the ministers the act talks about minister? Which minister are they talking about there? Does the West African Gas Pipeline Project Act talk about one specific minister to take charge of this area? Nobody. I won't tell you the answer. Since you're not serious. None of you have obviously read the acts. No, Allah. Go and look it
No,
up.
sir.
And go ahead now. I'm listening.
No, I said we did not hear you for a few minutes, sir.
Okay, I asked you a question. I said the act keeps talking about the minister may do this, minister may do that. Which is the minister they're referring to? What minister is this? Does the
Sir, that
treaty
would be Minister for Petroleum, sir.
Minister for Petroleum?
No, sir.
Are you sure? Why didn't you go and find out and tell us in the next class? I mean, I understand is there a Minister of State for Gas? Who does the actual work? Okay, when you say Minister of Petroleum as the overhead boss, which is I think is the
No,
president.
sir.
Eh?
No, sir.
You have a Minister of Petroleum Resources, which is the president, right? But underneath him, who are the people who are doing the work? Minister of State for Petroleum, Minister of State for Gas. That also. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Okay. There's another question I really wanted to ask. Now I've completely forgot. Okay. Okay. Let me. Yes, I talked about the power of the minister, what have you, what have you. I always look up. There's always an interpretation section, but does the interpretation section of this provision specify? Every legislation has an interpretation section. I'm sure you know that. Eh? I want you to always be familiar with legislation. That's why I don't want to regurgitate it for you. I want you to learn to read legislation. It's part of your training as good lawyers. The ability to sit down and read legislation. You must be able to read legislation. You should not be afraid of legislation. It will not bite you. When you read it first, it's not everything you understand on day one. It took you years to be able to read properly the way you are reading now. It took you years, did it not? So why are you afraid to do things? I want you to take your time. I would like you to take your time and read. Enjoy it. Don't be afraid. Print it out. Take a pen and read it. Put question marks on it. I don't understand this. I understand this. I don't like this. I like this. Just see how you feel about it. Learn to have an opinion, not hiding behind yourself and laughing at those who actually set up an opinion. Your lack of an opinion shows that you have no capacity, and that's not true of you guys. I mean, what would be the point of being in this school if all of you have no capacity? That would be ridiculous. My students just wasted my time. So please have that in your mind. Don't be afraid to have an opinion. And don't be afraid that your opinion has to be right or wrong or whatever. Sometimes it's a matter of law. It can be different opinions. Give your opinion and give reasons why this is what you believe. I respect that more than if you just want to be parroting anything I say. I find that very irritating. So I'm trying to develop you to have your own voice, not parrots or psychopaths. Okay? Thank you. So I was talking about, what else did I talk about? Yes, financial provisions. You can look up the financial provisions as provided for in the um, uh, part 5. Part 5 talks about the financial provisions, and this it provides an in-depth uh, review of the various things. Yes, I was going to say that it talks about section 28. It talks about the authority of the NNPC. Does NNPC exist anymore, or is it dead? Think about it. Part 6 talks about environmental provisions. Okay, very important. Part 6. Part 7 is miscellaneous and talks about different issues that you have to bear in mind. Okay. Now, if we talk about the tax, the financial, agreed financial, the financial provision in uh, part 5, part 5, part 5 deals with the agreed financial, the kind of financial provisions that will govern the West African gas pipeline. Now, 23 talks about section 23 talks about the liability for and the calculation of a method of assessment of tax payable by the company and each West African gas pipeline company in relation to the WACC income shall be in accordance with the provisions set out in first schedule to this act. Okay. 24 is very clear. Non-West African gas pipeline regime shall not apply to this company. Okay, except as set out in first schedule to this act. So if the act does not allow something that's not in West African gas pipeline to apply, it will not and cannot apply. Okay. So the rules of the buyers that governs the buyers, sellers, shippers, project contractors, they're all as itemized in the first schedule. There's issues there of use of foreign currency and foreign transactions and what have you. Things that you have to bear in mind. 28 talks about NNPC, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation Act 1990. Does that and also section 29 also talks about the NNPC Projects Act 1993. Does it apply any longer if, in view of the fact that the NNPC is now NNPC Limited? There is legal problem. Lawyers, I want you to avert your mind. Is there a legal problem now there? Section 31 talks about waiver of immunity. Talks about waiver of immunity. And it's saying that subject to such exceptions as is contained in any commercial agreement which is party, Nigeria or the NNPC unconditionally waives any immunity from suits, execution, or legal process. Because if you don't waive sovereign immunity, and I go and do business with you, Nigeria or the NNPC, and then there's a problem, you now say, no, I'm a government, I have immunity. No. There's an express waiver of sovereign immunity. Okay. Part 6, as I said earlier, talks about environmental provisions. Section 32 on general environmental liability says that the company, that's the West African Gas Pipeline Company, its affiliates, shareholders, or the project contractors shall be liable for any environmental damage that are caused by reason of any of the project activities. The company, its affiliates, So when you say Chevron Nigeria or Shell Nigeria is involved, does that mean that liability can track down all the way to Shell HQ in the Netherlands? Shareholders, which are the governments, or the project contractors shall be liable for any environmental damage. As soon as they give you that general environmental liability, Section 33 starts to walk back immediately, starts to run away from it. 33 says that the company, any of the shareholders or affiliates, lenders, or the project contractors shall not be liable for any environmental damage that occurs other by reason of any of the project activities. Any environmental damage that occurs other than by reason of, look, that's where the argument would lie. Is this particular environmental damage the result of project activities or not? So there's a get out of jail clause. Okay. So under 33.2, any environmental damage or adverse environmental effects identified in the EIA of the project as existing prior to construction shall be deemed to be deemed to have existed prior to the commitment of the project activities and shall not be deemed to have been caused by the company, its affiliates, shareholders, or whatever. See, they give you rights with one hand, take it away with another hand. Well, clearly, section 3.3, subsection 3 is very clear. No buyer, seller, or shipper. So those who use the pipelines have zero liability for environmental damage, unless it was caused by their own activity. Okay. Excellent. Part 7, as I talked about, talks about miscellaneous provisions. Sorry, guys, I'm struggling with your class. Let me try and round up. Yeah. Remember, I talked about ownership of the pipeline under the treaty, section 37. 37 here talks about the ownership of the pipeline system. 37.1, pipeline system when placed in, under, or over land, in accordance with terms of the license, shall remain the property of the company. That's the West African Gas Pipeline Company, notwithstanding any suspension, termination, cancellation, or expiry of the license. So even if the license under which it operates is terminated or suspended or cancelled, or even that license expires, the company will continue to own the pipeline system. Subsection 2 of 37 says, no third party shall acquire ownership or interest in the pipeline system merely by the fact that it owns any rights in, under, or over the land. So the fact that you are the landowner or whatever will not give you any rights to the pipeline. All right? Supremacy provision, section 40. Section 40, supremacy. Section 40. Very clear. Please bear it in mind. Section 40. That talks about inconsistency of this provision of this act with other laws. Section 40. That's usually called the supremacy law. Subject to the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999. If any other law in Nigeria is inconsistent with the provisions of this act for the purposes of this project, this act shall prevail. This act shall prevail. And the other law shall, to the extent of the inconsistency, be consequentially amended. If any other law, subject to the Constitution of 1999, if any other law in Nigeria is inconsistent with the provisions of this act, for the purposes of this project, we slims it down to the purpose of the project, this act shall prevail, underline it. And that other law shall, to the extent of its inconsistency, be consequentially amended. Very, very powerful provision. Very, 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 very. Okay. we together? Okay. If you look at the interpretation section, minister, in inverted comma, minister means the minister for the time being charged with responsibility for petroleum. Interesting, isn't it? Minister means the minister for the time being charged with responsibility for petroleum. So, can you let me know, is it the Minister of State for Petroleum that is doing this work now, or the Minister of State for Natural? Okay. And then I don't want to discuss issues of income tax, or what have you. I want to just keep it to the key issues which I've discussed with you, because I don't want to overwhelm you with too much detail that you're not even able to understand properly. So let's keep it at that. Okay. There's a fiscal regime, of course. You can see from the provisions. There's I mentioned the Fiscal Review Board. So subject to the appeal, we have a right to appeal to the West African Gas Pipeline Tribunal. Then you have the Fiscal Review Board would look into it as well. I mentioned all that. We need to go back. This. Then you have issues in the schedules, that two schedules, the schedules to the act that provides much more detail on what is required to do. Okay. So on that note, I round it up. Say, take your time. Take your time. Look carefully at the similarities and differences between these two important provisions. There'll be things that are similar on. There are things that would be different. Okay. For instance, the treaty, of course, is an international treaty, while the act basically implements Nigeria's treaty obligations under domestic law. So one establishes the legal institutional framework for cross-border gas transportation, while the other would implement Nigeria's treaty obligations under its domestic law. And as you know, the treaty was signed by Republic of Benin, Ghana, Nigeria, and Togo under ECOWAS, while the act, basically Nigerian act, gives recognition and effect to the West African Gas Pipeline and Treaty and recognize and related protocols. It's not just the treaty, but the act also gives effect to related protocols. The WACPO will create its Committee of Ministers and the West African Gas Pipeline Authority for governance, while the act recognizes West African Gas Pipeline Authority's powers within the Nigerian jurisdiction. Okay? One creates it, one recognizes the powers within Nigerian jurisdiction. The treaty recognizes the West African Gas Pipeline Company, WAPCO, while the act grants WAPCO operational rights and legal status in Nigeria. Okay. There's the uniform regulatory regime that was established under the Treaty for Cross-Border Consistency. And then in the act applies that uniform code as binding law. Binding regulation is binding within Nigeria. Don't forget the treaty goes across border. The legislation only deals with Nigeria. The treaty obliges states to provide rights of way for pipeline infrastructure. I mentioned it. While the act will authorize land acquisition and rights of way for pipeline projects in Nigeria. The treaty grants tax exemptions and customs waivers for the project. Tax exemptions and project customs waivers are granted under the treaty, while the act provides tax, VAT, and other exemptions for Nigeria. I think I also mentioned the environmental issues, where the treaty commits to international environmental safety standards. The Act also deals with that. What about dispute resolution mechanisms? What is the status under the treaty? We negotiate, we arbitrate, whatever. All these things are look at the two ways and how they deal with dispute resolution. The treaty has a stability clause to protect investor interests. Stability clause, very important. It includes a stability clause to protect the interests of the investors. But the act gives primacy to the uniform code over conflicting laws. That's why I talked about the supremacy provision. Apart from the constitution, the Nigerian constitution is the only law elevated above that uniform provision. Look at the issues of any offenses and penalties under the truth. Are there any offenses? So, I'm just giving you some highlights. I want you to do some in-depth work to review and I will ask you not to start to take shortcuts and go and look for answers elsewhere. Take the two things, read it yourself, and do your own first homework. Don't be looking for shortcuts, because when you look for shortcuts, you will not develop the skills I want you to develop. Okay? So we have two legal instruments: the Pipeline Treaty, the West African Gas Pipeline Project Act. And, are they similar? Of course, they have similarities. It's the same legal foundation for the same project. The two instruments provide the legal institutional framework for development and operation of the West African Gas Pipeline. The two of them will recognize the WAPCO company. It recognizes the fact that they have rights and privileges and so forth. The two underscore the commitment to cross-border cooperation. It was signed under ECOWAS by Benin, Togo, Ghana, Nigeria. There's a uniform legal regime that governs West African gas pipeline regulations, the uniform code, which is in both the treaties and also in the law. Both of these laws talk about project stability, so that investors will be happy. But are there any differences? Sure, there might be some differences. A multilateral treaty for that matter, that's signed by different countries under ECOWAS, is a supranational authority. It's not the same thing as the act, which is a purely legislative national law passed by the National Assembly to domesticate that treaty. And because of the legal nature of that, of the two, the scope will be different. The treaty will apply across board to the 4 participating states, and it governs interstate cooperation and obligations. Nigerian acts only apply domestically within the jurisdiction of Nigeria, and is basically just implementing Nigeria's treaty obligations. Okay? Are we doing okay? Are we okay? Nobody's available. Don't go.
Yes, sir. I wanted to ask a question because I don't really understand the part of that immunity section that you explained before.
Supremacy clause.
Yeah, immunity, yes, sir.
What is my immunity?
You said something
You didn't
about
hear well. Go and read the legislation, the two laws. It's called supremacy clause. We are saying that if any law, apart from the constitution, is not in accordance with this West African Gas Pipeline Project Act, then that law will be amended to the extent of its inconsistency. Is that what you are talking about?
No,
that's why you are encouraged to read ahead. You will not have these problems if you had read ahead. So go and think about it. And if you are still confused, let's discuss it. Okay? All right. I talked about institutional rules. The treaty creates its own governance bodies, committee of ministers, West African Gas Pipeline Authority, blah, 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 blah. But Nigerian law also designates its own Nigerian institutions, the Minister of Petroleum Resources, who enforces the decisions of the West African Gas Pipeline Authority within Nigeria. Is there an enforcement mechanism? The enforcement mechanisms in treaties are always different from that of a legislation. A treaty will talk about states level obligations and dispute resolution between states. But the legislation will be talking about enforcement of the rights of way, enforcement of the regulations, dispute settlement or resolution within the Nigerian legal system. So it's different from that point of view. Tax and fiscal regime is different. The treaty will just contain just broad commitments on tax exemptions or fiscal incentives, just very broad. But the specific details of these exemptions or privileges will be found in the legislation of the act. And if you talk about legal hierarchy, I know people don't always put this there, and that's one of the first things you talk about. Legal hierarchy, states or international instruments are on a higher level than domestic law. So from the point of view of the legal hierarchy, the first thing to do is the higher level international instruments binding on all parties is what a treaty is. When an act is subject to Nigerian constitutional law and implements the obligations that Nigeria itself has signed up to at the international level. See, I've given you, I didn't want to say anything about it, but I've given you, sufficient sufficient info or expo or whatever you want to call it. I don't know. You guys, you love all this stuff now. All right. Any other questions? Because I want to round up the class. Just completely done. Any questions, please? Please go and read ahead. Go and read what I've asked you to do. Because I don't know what's the next thing on the program. Let me look at the what's out. Nobody has any questions. You're also brilliant. Eh? See, everybody winner. Okay. So what I'll try and do in the next class is to move very quickly through pipeline, the pipelines as discussed. So go and read ahead of that one. I'm just going to ask you to talk about it. I won't talk. Oil and gas pipelines under that's on Monday. Oil and gas pipelines under the Petroleum Industry Act. Okay. Once we've done that, we go straight to taxation very quickly, and then talk about dispute settlement. Because this taxation is a very big cost. You can do an entire year of talking on taxation. So I'm just going to put you through the key things I need you to know. And dispute settlement, same thing. And then very quickly, we won't be called controversies. I'll just pick and choose. I'll pick something that you like, maybe like something about refineries. Allow you guys to, I'll just discuss petroleum downstream and all this very quickly, just in passing. But we'll talk about refineries. Well, refineries is hot potato now. And then once we've done that, Professor K can come to class. I don't even know how much time I have to do all these things because I believe that we have spent a lot more time in class than we should have. And some of this time has been eaten up by what do they call those things? Holidays. Nigerians and their love for holidays shall be well with us. Class rep, let me know how much time I still have in class so I can hand it over to Professor OK. And that I don't want you guys to be rushed too much. So I need to be much more quick about it. So may well be that next class I will try and do pipelines and talk about taxation at the same time. That we don't unduly body you. All right. No questions, no comments. You're all happy. You're all wonderfully happy and all that. Okay, lovely. Thank you so much for coming to class. And God willing, we'll see on Monday. Okay. Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
All right, so have a nice day.
Okay, sir.